Emma Richardson stood at the grand windows of Whitmore Estate, watching the morning mist roll across the Yorkshire countryside. At 34, she had never imagined her life would take such a dramatic turn. Just 3 years ago, she was a simple literature teacher in Manchester, content with her small apartment and weekend walks in the park. Now, she was the Duchess of Whitmore, married to Duke Alexander Whitmore, one of England's most beloved public figures. The transformation hadn't been easy. Alexander, at 36, carried the weight of centuries-old traditions on his shoulders. His family had served the crown for generations, and he took his duties seriously. Unlike Emma's quiet upbringing in a middle-class family, Alexander had grown up surrounded by protocol, public appearances, and constant scrutiny. Their love story had captured the nation's heart, the commoner who won the heart of the Duke through her genuine kindness and intelligence rather than noble birth. Emma remembered their first meeting at a charity event for literacy programs. She had been invited as a representative of her school's reading initiative. Alexander was there in his official capacity, but what struck her wasn't his title or wealth. It was how he knelt down to speak with the children at their eye level, how his laugh was genuine when a 6-year-old mispronounced his name. That night, they talked for hours about books, education, and their shared belief that reading could change lives. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of stolen moments between Alexander's official duties. Late-night phone calls when he returned from state functions, quiet walks through Hyde Park with minimal security, and intimate dinners where they could simply be Emma and Alex, not the teacher and the Duke. The media attention was overwhelming at first. Photographers followed Emma to work, reporters called her childhood friends, and every outfit choice was analyzed in newspapers. But Alexander helped her navigate this new world. He taught her about royal protocol, not as rigid rules to follow, but as ways to show respect for the people they served. He explained that their position wasn't about privilege, but about responsibility, using their platform to make meaningful change in people's lives. Emma found purpose in supporting causes close to her heart: education reform, mental health awareness, and supporting families in crisis. The wedding had been a fairy tale that the entire nation celebrated. Unlike the stuffy affairs of previous generations, Emma and Alexander chose to include elements that reflected their values. They invited representatives from every charity they supported, included readings from diverse authors, and made sure the celebration honored both tradition and progress. The image of Emma in her grandmother's simple pearl necklace alongside the Whitmore family tiara became iconic, representing the beautiful blend of her humble roots and her new role. Their first years of marriage brought challenges neither had expected. The constant public attention was exhausting. Every argument, every tired moment after a long day of public appearances, every human emotion had to be carefully managed. Emma struggled with the loss of privacy, missing the days when she could cry over a sad movie or laugh too loudly at a friend's joke without worrying about photographers capturing an unflattering moment. Alexander watched his wife adapt with admiration and growing concern. He saw how she threw herself into her charitable work, becoming a passionate advocate for children's education and family services. But he also noticed the moments when she would stare out windows with a distant expression, the way she sometimes hesitated before answering the phone, knowing it might be another request for a public appearance or interview. Despite the challenges, their love deepened. They found ways to maintain intimacy in their very public life. Sunday mornings became sacred. No official duties, no staff meetings, just the two of them reading newspapers in bed and planning their garden together. Alexander learned to make Emma's favorite tea just the way she liked it, and Emma discovered that beneath his formal exterior, her husband was a man who collected vintage books and could quote entire passages from poetry that moved him. The couple's work began to make real impact. Their foundation launched mobile libraries that brought books to rural communities. They advocated successfully for increased funding for schools in underserved areas. Emma's background in education proved invaluable as she could speak authentically about classroom challenges and connect with teachers and parents in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. But it was their response to personal tragedy that would truly define their public role. When Alexander's beloved grandfather, the former Duke, passed away suddenly, the nation watched as the couple grieved openly and honestly. Rather than maintaining stiff upper lips, they shared their sorrow in a way that felt human and relatable. Their eulogy at the memorial service, delivered together, spoke about love, legacy, and the importance of cherishing the time we have with those we love. The public response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from families sharing their own experiences with loss, from children who had been inspired by the mobile library program, from teachers whose schools had been transformed by the foundation's support. Emma began to understand that their visibility wasn't just about representing tradition. It was about representing hope and possibility for ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. As autumn settled over Whitmore Estate, Emma found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that first charity event. The scared teacher who had worried about using the wrong fork at formal dinners had become a confident advocate who could address Parliament about education policy. The reserved Duke who had been taught to hide his emotions had learned to lead with both strength and vulnerability. Their relationship had become a partnership in the truest sense. They complemented each other's strengths, Alexander's deep understanding of political processes and Emma's grassroots connection to community needs. Together, they were building something meaningful, using their unique position to create lasting change while remaining true to the values that brought them together. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, just as Emma was reviewing plans for the Foundation's winter reading program. Alexander had left early for a meeting with agricultural ministers about sustainable farming initiatives, one of his longtime passions. The autumn had been particularly beautiful at Whitmore Estate, with golden leaves creating a carpet across the grounds that Emma loved to walk through during her morning reflection time. Margaret, Alexander's private secretary, knocked softly on the library door where Emma was working. The older woman's face was pale, and Emma immediately sensed something was wrong. Margaret had been with the Whitmore family for over 15 years, and Emma had never seen her composure slip like this. "Your Grace," Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's been an accident involving His Grace." The words seemed to echo strangely in Emma's ears. She found herself setting down her pen very carefully, as if this simple action could somehow maintain normalcy. "What kind of accident?" she asked, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. The details came in fragments that would later blur together in Emma's memory. Alexander's car had been struck by a truck whose driver had suffered a medical emergency. The accident happened on a rural road between two of their charitable project sites that Alexander visited regularly. He had been conscious when the paramedics arrived, asking about the other driver's condition even as they worked to extract him from the vehicle. Emma's training in crisis management, something all family members learned as part of their preparation for public life, kicked in automatically. She found herself asking practical questions about which hospital, what injuries, who had been notified, while another part of her mind seemed to float above the conversation, unable to fully process what was happening. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of countryside that Emma normally loved but now barely saw. Security personnel had quickly organized the journey, and Margaret sat beside her, handling phone calls and logistics while Emma stared out the window, trying to pray but finding her mind strangely blank. At the Royal Victoria Hospital, Emma was led through private corridors away from the gathering media. The lead surgeon, Dr. Patricia Chun, met her with the kind of gentle directness that Emma would later realize was both a professional skill and a kindness. Alexander had sustained significant internal injuries and was undergoing emergency surgery. The next several hours would be critical. Emma found herself in a private waiting room that felt surreal in its ordinary comfort. Soft chairs, magazines, a window overlooking a garden where people walked dogs and children played. The normalcy of the scene contrasted sharply with the gravity of the situation. Margaret had arranged for close friends and family to be notified, but Emma specifically requested that no public statement be made until they knew more. The waiting stretched endlessly. Emma paced between the window and the chairs, her mind cycling through memories in no particular order. Alexander teaching her to ride horses on their estate, patient and encouraging when she was nervous around the large animals. Their last conversation that morning about whether they should add more fruit trees to the estate's orchard. The way he always kissed her forehead when he left for early meetings. Dr. Chen returned after what felt like both hours and minutes. The surgery had gone well, but Alexander remained in critical condition. The next 48 hours would be crucial in determining his recovery trajectory. Emma was allowed to see him briefly, a moment that would be seared into her memory forever. The strong, confident man who had stood beside her at countless public events was unconscious, surrounded by machines, looking vulnerable in a way that made Emma's chest tighten with protective love. That first night, Emma refused to leave the hospital. She had a small cot brought to Alexander's room and maintained a vigil that the nursing staff gently worked around. She held his hand and talked to him about their plans for the Foundation's holiday campaign, about the letters they had received from school children, about anything that might reach him in his unconscious state. By morning, word of the accident had leaked to the media despite the family's attempts at privacy. Emma woke to Margaret gently shaking her shoulder and explaining that reporters were gathering outside the hospital. The family's communications director needed guidance on how to handle the public response. Emma realized that even in this most private and frightening moment, they couldn't escape their public responsibilities. The statement they released was carefully crafted to provide essential information while requesting privacy. But Emma insisted on one personal touch, a note of gratitude for the paramedics and hospital staff, and a request that people keep the truck driver, who was also hospitalized, in their thoughts. Even in crisis, Alexander would have wanted them to remember that others were affected too. The second day brought small signs of improvement. Alexander briefly opened his eyes and squeezed Emma's hand when she spoke to him. Dr. Chun was cautiously optimistic, explaining that while he wasn't out of danger, these were positive indicators. Emma allowed herself to feel a flutter of hope for the first time since the accident. But it was also the day that the full weight of public attention descended. The hospital had to implement additional security measures as flowers, cards, and gifts began arriving from across the nation and beyond. Emma was touched by the genuine outpouring of concern, but also overwhelmed by the reminder that their pain was being shared by millions of people who felt connected to their story. Letters arrived from families who had met them at charity events, from school children whose libraries had been supported by their foundation, from people who simply felt that Alexander and Emma represented something hopeful in an often difficult world. A group of teachers from Emma's former school organized a prayer vigil. Farmers from across the region sent messages of support, remembering Alexander's advocacy for rural communities. Emma began to understand that their public role meant that their personal crisis had become, in some way, a shared experience. While part of her resented this intrusion into their most vulnerable moment, she also found strength in the knowledge that so many people were hoping and praying for Alexander's recovery. On the third day, Alexander was conscious for longer periods, though still very weak. His first coherent words were to ask about the other driver, showing Emma that even in his injured state, his character remained unchanged. When she told him that the truck driver was recovering well and had been asking about Alexander's condition, he insisted that they send flowers and a personal note to the man's family. The doctors began to speak more optimistically about recovery, though they cautioned that it would be a long process. Alexander would need extensive rehabilitation, and it would be months before he could resume his full duties, if ever. Emma realized they were facing a new chapter of their life together, one that would test not only their love for each other, but their ability to adapt their public role to new limitations and challenges. As she sat beside Alexander's bed that evening, watching him sleep more peacefully than he had since the accident, Emma reflected on how quickly everything could change. 3 days ago, their biggest concern had been whether to expand their holiday charity campaign. Now they were facing fundamental questions about the future of their work, their health, and how to navigate recovery under public scrutiny. But watching Alexander's steady breathing and feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since Margaret's first words about the accident: genuine hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they had faced every challenge of their public life so far. The rehabilitation center at Millbrook became Alexander and Emma's second home for the next 6 months. Unlike the sterile environment of the hospital, Millbrook specialized in long-term recovery and was designed to feel more like a comfortable retreat than a medical facility. Alexander's injuries had been more severe than initially understood. Damage to his spine had left him with limited mobility in his legs, and the traumatic brain injury, though mild, affected his energy levels and concentration. Emma watched her husband struggle with frustrations that went far beyond the physical challenges. Alexander had always been a man of action, someone who could walk into any room and command attention through his presence and energy. Now, simple tasks like transferring from bed to wheelchair exhausted him, and the cognitive effects of his injury meant that reading, once his greatest pleasure, became difficult after just a few minutes. The first month at Millbrook was the hardest. Alexander went through periods of deep depression, questioning whether he could continue in his public role, and wondering if Emma would be better off without the burden of caring for him. These conversations happened in the early hours of the morning, when pain medications made him feel simultaneously drowsy and restless, and His usual optimism seemed impossibly far away. Emma found herself becoming Alexander's advocate in ways she had never expected. She learned about spinal injuries, worked with physical therapists to understand his treatment plan, and gradually took on more of the communication with their staff and charitable organizations. The foundation's work couldn't stop, and Emma discovered that she had developed skills and confidence she hadn't realized she possessed. The public response to Alexander's condition continued to be overwhelming. The rehabilitation center had to hire additional staff to handle the volume of mail and flowers. Emma was particularly moved by letters from other families dealing with serious injuries and disabilities, sharing their experiences and offering practical advice alongside emotional support. One letter that arrived in February was from Sarah Mitchell, a teacher from Cornwall whose husband had been paralyzed in a farming accident 3 years earlier. Sarah wrote about the grief process that came with major life changes, the way relationships evolve and sometimes become even stronger, and practical tips for navigating accessibility challenges. Emma found herself corresponding with Sarah and eventually invited her to visit Millbrook. Sarah's visit marked a turning point for both Alexander and Emma. Sarah's husband, David, arrived in a specialized wheelchair, and Emma watched Alexander's face change as he realized he was speaking with someone who had successfully rebuilt a meaningful life after catastrophic injury. David talked about returning to farming with adaptive equipment, about the new perspectives his experience had given him, and about the ways his relationship with Sarah had deepened rather than diminished. That conversation led to Alexander's first real engagement with his rehabilitation program. Instead of going through the motions, he began setting goals with his physical therapist and working with the occupational therapy team to develop strategies for resuming his duties. He wouldn't be able to do everything exactly as he had before, but perhaps he could find new ways to serve. Emma, meanwhile, was discovering her own evolving role. She had always supported Alexander's work, but now she was taking the lead on many initiatives. Their foundation's spring campaign for rural education funding became primarily her project, and she found herself giving speeches and meeting with government officials with a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. The most challenging aspect was navigating their changed intimate relationship. Alexander's injuries affected not just his mobility, but his sense of masculine identity. Emma had to learn to be patient with his frustrations while also maintaining her own emotional health. They began working with a counselor who specialized in relationships affected by major medical events, learning new ways to communicate and connect. Spring brought an unexpected opportunity. The government was launching a major initiative on accessibility and inclusion, and they specifically requested Alexander and Emma's involvement. Rather than seeing his injury as disqualifying him from public service, officials recognized that his experience could bring valuable perspective to policy discussions. Alexander was initially reluctant, worried about how he would appear in public and whether people would see his limitations rather than his capabilities. But Emma convinced him that their experience could help other families facing similar challenges, and that his voice in accessibility discussions could create meaningful change. Their first public appearance since the accident was at a conference on adaptive technology. Emma was nervous about the media attention, knowing that every aspect of Alexander's appearance and mobility would be scrutinized. But Alexander surprised everyone, including himself, with his composure and eloquence as he spoke about the need for better support systems for people with disabilities. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Rather than pity or awkward sympathy, the feedback focused on Alexander's insights and the practical solutions he proposed. One journalist wrote that Alexander had never been more compelling as a public figure than when he spoke from personal experience about overcoming challenges. That success led to more opportunities. Alexander began advising on accessibility standards for public buildings, while Emma expanded their foundation's focus to include support for families dealing with sudden medical crises. They discovered that their personal experience had given them a unique platform for advocacy that felt more meaningful than their previous charitable work. Summer brought a major milestone: Alexander's first steps with the assistance of specialized braces and walking aids. The moment was captured by a photographer who had been documenting his recovery journey, and the image became iconic, not as inspiration porn, but as a genuine representation of the hard work and determination that recovery requires. Emma realized that she had changed as much as Alexander during this period. The quiet teacher who had once worried about protocol had become a confident advocate who could address Parliament about healthcare funding with the same ease as she once reserved for parent-teacher conferences. Her work was no longer just supporting Alexander's initiatives. She had developed her own areas of expertise and passion. Their relationship, too, had evolved in unexpected ways. While they had lost some things, the spontaneity of their early marriage, certain physical capabilities, the innocence of believing they were invulnerable, they had gained others. Their communication had become more direct and honest. Their shared purpose felt deeper and more authentic. They had learned to find joy and intimacy in new ways. By autumn, Alexander was ready to resume a modified schedule of public appearances. Their first joint engagement was at the opening of an adaptive playground that their foundation had helped fund. Watching children of all abilities play together, Emma reflected on how far they had all come. The accident had changed everything about their lives and their work. But rather than diminishing their impact, it had deepened their understanding of service and given them new ways to connect with people facing their own challenges. Alexander would never again be the physically imposing figure he had once been, but he had become something perhaps more valuable, a genuine advocate who spoke from lived experience rather than privileged good intentions. As they watched the children play, Alexander reached for Emma's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for never letting me give up on us, or on this work." Emma squeezed his hand, knowing that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they had proven they could face them together and find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday at Whitmore Estate, but it would end as one of the most significant days in Alexander and Emma's public life. Emma was in the conservatory, working on correspondence with families who had reached out about accessibility challenges, when Margaret arrived with Dr. Chun and another specialist, Dr. Robert Hughes, a neurologist from London. Alexander had been experiencing increasing headaches over the past few weeks, and his latest scans had revealed concerning changes. Dr. Hughes explained gently that the traumatic brain injury from the accident had led to the development of a rare condition that was progressively affecting Alexander's cognitive functions. While not immediately life-threatening, the condition would likely continue to worsen, eventually affecting his memory, speech, and reasoning abilities. The diagnosis hit Emma like a physical blow. They had worked so hard to rebuild their life after the accident, finding new purposes and ways to serve. Alexander had adapted to his mobility challenges with grace and determination. This felt like a cruel second tragedy, taking away the mental capabilities that had always been Alexander's greatest strength. Alexander took the news with the same composure he had shown throughout his recovery, asking detailed questions about treatment options and timeline. But Emma could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hand trembled slightly as he took notes about the specialist's recommendations. That evening, alone in their private sitting room, he broke down completely for the first time since the accident. "I can handle not being able to walk properly," he told Emma through tears that seemed to surprise him with their intensity. "But my mind, Emma. If I lose my mind, who am I? How can I serve anyone if I can't think clearly?" Emma held him while he grieved this new loss, understanding that he wasn't just mourning his future limitations, but the gradual loss of the identity he had spent his entire life building. Alexander had always been known for his intelligence, his ability to grasp complex policy issues, his skill at remembering names and faces from years of public service. The next few weeks were devoted to seeking second opinions and exploring treatment options. While there were medications that might slow the progression, there was no cure or reversal possible. The specialists estimated that Alexander might have several good years before the symptoms became severely limiting, but the timeline was uncertain. Emma watched her husband wrestle with the decision of whether to make his diagnosis public. His instinct was toward transparency. They had always been honest with the people they served. But he was also concerned about becoming a figure of pity rather than respect, and worried about the impact on the causes they championed. The decision was ultimately made for them when Alexander had a brief episode of confusion during a public appearance at a veterans support center. While he recovered quickly, the incident was noted by several journalists, and speculation about his health began circulating. Rather than allow rumors to spread, they decided to make a controlled announcement. Emma worked with their communications team to craft a statement that was honest about the diagnosis while emphasizing Alexander's commitment to continuing his work for as long as possible. They decided to make the announcement during a speech at their foundation's annual gala, speaking directly to the people who had supported them through previous challenges. The night of the gala, Emma stood beside Alexander at the podium, looking out at an audience that included everyone from government ministers to families they had helped through various programs. Alexander's speech was one of the most powerful he had ever given, combining honesty about his condition with determination to use whatever time and capabilities he retained to make a meaningful difference. "Emma, and I have learned that life rarely follows the plans we make," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "But we've also learned that purpose doesn't depend on perfect health or unlimited time. It depends on choosing to serve others with whatever gifts we have, for as long as we're able to use them." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Rather than treating the announcement as the end of Alexander's public career, supporters rallied around a sense of urgency about making the most of the time he had left. Donations to their foundation increased dramatically, and requests for Alexander's involvement in accessibility and healthcare advocacy multiplied. Emma found herself taking on an even more prominent role, but now with the explicit understanding that she was preparing to eventually carry forward their work independently. Alexander began what he called his knowledge transfer project, recording videos about the causes he cared about, documenting his understanding of policy issues, and introducing Emma to key relationships and processes she would need to continue their mission. One of the most meaningful projects during this period was the creation of the Alexander Whitmore Fellowship Program, designed to support young people with disabilities who wanted to pursue careers in public service. Alexander personally mentored the first group of fellows, sharing not just his knowledge of government and policy, but his understanding of how to turn personal challenges into sources of strength for serving others. Emma watched her husband throw himself into this work with an intensity that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She could see the subtle changes in his cognitive abilities, moments when he struggled to find words, times when he seemed briefly confused about familiar procedures. But she could also see his determination to make every remaining day count. Their relationship continued to evolve in ways that surprised them both. Knowing that their time together might be limited in new ways made them more intentional about creating meaningful moments. They started taking evening walks through the estate gardens, during which Alexander would share memories from his childhood and early career, wanting to ensure that Emma understood not just his work, but the experiences that had shaped his values. They also began collaborating on a book about their experience, focusing not on the medical challenges, but on what they had learned about finding purpose through adversity. The writing process became a way of processing their journey, while also creating something that might help other families facing unexpected challenges. The book project revealed how much Alexander's perspectives had shifted since the accident and diagnosis. The privileged young duke who had inherited his position and wealth had become someone who understood vulnerability and the importance of systems that support people through crisis. His advocacy for healthcare funding and accessibility rights came not from abstract charitable impulses, but from lived experience of depending on these services. Emma's role as collaborator and eventually primary author as Alexander's writing abilities fluctuated gave her new confidence in her own voice and perspectives. She had stories to tell about being thrust into public life, about learning to navigate enormous responsibility while maintaining authenticity, about discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed. By winter, the changes in Alexander's condition were becoming more noticeable to those who knew him well, though he continued to function effectively in most situations. They made the difficult decision to reduce his public appearances to focus on the projects that mattered most to him, particularly the fellowship program and the book. Emma realized that she was experiencing a form of anticipatory grief, mourning losses that hadn't yet occurred while trying to appreciate what they still had. The man she had married, brilliant, confident, seemingly invincible, was still present, but she could see him changing in ways that reminded her daily of their altered future. Yet there were also unexpected gifts in this period. Alexander's vulnerability had made him more emotionally expressive than he had ever been. He told Emma daily how much he loved her, thanked her constantly for her dedication, and spoke openly about his fears and hopes in ways that deepened their intimacy. Their conversations had a richness and honesty that might never have developed without the urgency created by his condition. As spring approached, Emma prepared for what might be Alexander's final major public speech at the opening of an accessible community center their foundation had funded. She knew that many people would attend specifically to see Alexander, understanding that opportunities to hear him speak were becoming limited. The speech was both a culmination of his advocacy work and a farewell of sorts, though Alexander didn't explicitly frame it that way. He spoke about the community center as a symbol of inclusion and possibility, about the importance of creating spaces where everyone could participate fully in society. His words carried the weight of personal experience in ways that moved the audience to tears and standing ovations. Watching from the side of the stage, Emma felt proud of how much they had accomplished together and heartbroken about what lay ahead. But she also felt a growing sense of her own mission and capabilities. Alexander had been her mentor in public service, but she had become his equal partner in ways that neither of them had anticipated when they first fell in love. Fifth Part Summer brought a bittersweet milestone to Whitmore Estate, the completion of Alexander's memoir, which had evolved into a joint autobiography, chronicling their journey from fairy tale romance to advocates forged by adversity. Emma had taken over most of the writing as Alexander's cognitive abilities fluctuated more dramatically, but the book remained their shared voice and vision for how personal challenges could be transformed into public service. The launch event for Our Unexpected Path was held in the estate's gardens, surrounded by the people who had supported them through every stage of their journey. Emma watched Alexander give what she knew would likely be his final major speech, his words sometimes hesitant, but his message clear and powerful. He spoke about gratitude, for the love they had found together, for the opportunities they had been given to serve, and for the communities that had sustained them through difficulties. Emma and I never chose the challenges we faced, Alexander said, his voice carrying across the gathering of friends, family, colleagues, and beneficiaries of their foundation work. But we did choose how to respond to them. We chose to believe that our experiences, however painful, could be useful to others facing their own unexpected paths. The book became an immediate bestseller, but more importantly to Emma and Alexander, it generated conversations about accessibility, caregiving, public service, and finding meaning through adversity. Letters arrived from readers who saw their own struggles reflected in the story, from families dealing with disability, from caregivers feeling overwhelmed by responsibility, from young people inspired to pursue service despite personal challenges. As autumn arrived, Alexander's condition had progressed significantly. He still had good days when his thoughts were clear and his personality unchanged, but there were increasingly frequent periods of confusion and memory loss. Emma had quietly taken over most of his official duties, with the understanding of their staff and the organizations they served. The hardest part wasn't managing the practical aspects of his care or even taking on additional professional responsibilities. It was watching the man she loved slowly lose access to the intellectual abilities that had defined him. Alexander had always been the one who remembered every detail of their charitable projects, who could quote policy papers and recall the names of everyone they met. Now Emma sometimes had to remind him of recent conversations or help him find words he was searching for. Yet there were moments of profound connection that surprised them both. Stripped of the formal demands of his public role, Alexander sometimes seemed more present and emotionally available than he had ever been. His declarations of love became more frequent and intense, as if his feelings were concentrated by the loss of other cognitive complexities. Emma began keeping a private journal during this period, documenting not just the progression of Alexander's condition, but her own emotional journey as she transitioned from wife and partner to primary caregiver while also becoming the public face of their foundation work. Writing became a way of processing the complex grief of losing someone who was still physically present, but changing in fundamental ways. The foundation's work continued to expand under Emma's leadership, now explicitly focused on supporting families through medical crises and advocating for better accessibility policies. Emma discovered that her background in education gave her unique insights into systems change, and her personal experience with caregiving made her an authentic advocate for support services. One of her proudest achievements during this period was the passage of legislation improving respite care services for families dealing with long-term medical conditions. Emma testified before Parliament about the isolation and exhaustion that caregivers experienced, speaking from personal knowledge about the need for systems that supported entire families, not just patients. Alexander was present for that testimony, though he had difficulty following all the details. Afterward, he told Emma how proud he was of her advocacy, recognizing that she had grown into a leader in her own right rather than simply carrying forward his initiatives. "You're not just continuing my work," he said during one of his clearer moments. "You're making it better than I ever could have alone." Winter brought the decision that Emma had been dreading but knew was necessary. Alexander's care needs had increased to the point where their home setup was no longer adequate. and his episodes of confusion sometimes included periods of distress that required professional intervention. They decided together, during one of his lucid periods, that he should move to a specialized facility while she maintained their home base and continued the foundation work. The move to Riverside Manor, a residential facility that specialized in neurological conditions, was heartbreaking despite being clearly necessary. Emma had decorated Alexander's room with photos from their travels, books he had loved, and items from the estate that held special meaning. She visited daily, often bringing work to do in his room so they could maintain some sense of shared routine. Emma's public role during this period became a delicate balance between transparency and privacy. She continued to provide general updates about Alexander's condition while protecting the intimate details of his decline. The public response remained supportive, with many people expressing admiration for her dedication and the grace with which she handled enormous personal and professional responsibilities. The Foundation's annual gala that year was dedicated to launching the Emma Richardson Whitmore Institute for Family Care Support, recognizing her evolution from uncertain newcomer to confident advocate. Emma's speech that night was perhaps the most personal she had ever given, talking about the unexpected education she had received in resilience, advocacy, and the different forms that love could take. Alexander taught me that public service isn't about being perfect or having all the answers, she told the audience. It's about showing up authentically and using whatever experiences you have to help others navigate their own challenges. Our story didn't turn out the way we expected, but it became something meaningful in ways we never could have planned. Spring brought a gradual acceptance of the new reality. Alexander's good days became less frequent, but Emma learned to find joy in small moments. When he smiled at familiar music, when he recognized her voice even if he couldn't remember her name, when he seemed peaceful and content despite his confusion. Emma's work had gained international recognition, with invitations to speak at conferences and collaborate with organizations worldwide. She realized that their personal tragedy had given her a platform and credibility that could benefit countless other families facing similar challenges. The last meaningful conversation Emma had with Alexander came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in May. He had been having a particularly clear day, and they sat together in the manor's garden, watching birds at the feeders he enjoyed observing. "Thank you for not giving up on us," he said, his words carefully chosen, but unmistakably sincere. "Thank you for making sure our story had meaning." Emma held his hand and told him about the latest letter from a family whose life had been changed by their foundation's support, about the young person with disabilities who had just started university with help from their scholarship program, about the accessibility improvements being implemented in public buildings because of advocacy he had inspired. She wanted him to know that their love story, however it might end, had created ripples of positive change that would continue long after their personal chapter concluded. That evening, alone in their estate home that now felt too large and quiet, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them from that first charity event to this moment. The scared teacher and the dutiful Duke had become something neither had imagined, partners in a kind of service that transformed personal pain into public purpose, advocates who could speak authentically about resilience because they had been forced to develop it themselves. Emma understood that she would likely face the future of their work alone, but she no longer felt unprepared or uncertain about her ability to carry it forward. Alexander had given her more than love and partnership. He had helped her discover capabilities and strength she might never have found otherwise. Their story was changing, but its meaning would endure in the lives they had touched and the systems they had helped improve. As she prepared for sleep in their bedroom that still held traces of Alexander's presence, Emma felt not just sadness for what they were losing, but gratitude for what they had created together and confidence in her ability to honor that legacy in whatever came next.